The air was dense with dampness and the faint trace of sweat, the kind of heaviness that clung to the skin and settled into the bones. Voices murmured low around her, mingling with the gentle clatter of glass and the whisper of movement. Lyra Quinn stood silently, wrists aching from the coarse restraints that had dug into her skin for hours, perhaps longer. The flickering overhead light offered no comfort, casting pale, trembling shadows across the concrete floor that seemed to stretch forever. She didn't know how long she'd been here. Time had unraveled, moments blurring into one another like a half-remembered dream. But one thing remained clear. If she didn't find a way out, there would be no more chances. No more days. Around her moved the quiet hum of wealth, silken suits, designer shoes, subtle scents of expensive cologne and colder intentions. Men lounged in leather chairs, their expressions sharp, eyes filled with that unmistakable gleam. Possession, not compassion. From a speaker overhead, a crisp voice rang out, cutting through the haze. Lot 17. A firm grip caught her arm. She was pulled forward, not harshly, but with a casual sort of authority that made her stomach turn. She steadied herself, shoulders square, chin lifted. She had learned quickly, fear was something these people noticed, something they enjoyed. So she gave them none. The voice continued, reciting facts about her, age, background, details stripped of identity and presented like statistics. But Lyra wasn't listening. Her eyes scanned the room instead. The exit was across the space, flanked by two silent attendants. A corridor beyond it disappeared into shadows. She had no plan yet, only instinct. But she would not remain here quietly. Then, unexpectedly, the energy in the room shifted. A hush settled. And only then did Lyra see him. He sat at the far end, removed from the others, as if the spectacle bored him. No drink in hand, no quiet conversation, no interest in what unfolded around him. He was still, controlled. His suit, dark and unassuming, blended with the shadowed corner he occupied. But his eyes, they caught the light like glass, unreadable, observing, detached from the rest of the world. 2 million. His voice was calm, measured, as if he were naming a price for a painting, not a life. The others shifted. Some scoffed, others grew quiet. The speaker paused just briefly, then concluded, sold. And just like that, her world changed again. Hands guided her forward. There was no ceremony, no cruelty, just motion. She wasn't a number anymore. She had become someone's choice. The first thing she noticed was warmth. Not the suffocating kind from the underground room, but a soft, even temperature that wrapped around her like a quiet comfort. The second was silence. Not emptiness, just stillness. She opened her eyes slowly. The bed beneath her was far too soft, the linens cool against her skin. She pushed herself up gently, head still heavy from disorientation. The room was beautiful. Unexpectedly so. Dark wood floors gleamed beneath her feet. The fireplace sat cold yet welcoming, carved in intricate stone. Furniture stood poised and untouched, as if no one had ever really lived here. She stood slowly. Her body was sore, but unharmed. No bruises, no marks. A strange unease crept over her. This wasn't punishment. It was something else entirely. She moved toward the door, cautious, her bare feet silent on the smooth floor. The carved wood door opened without resistance, unlocked. That alone unsettled her more than any locked one would have. Beyond it stretched a long corridor, walls adorned with oil paintings that looked far older than the house itself. And still, not a single sound followed her. She was alone. Unbound, unwatched, but never, not truly free. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its high walls looming above her like stone guardians. Ornate, cold, and imposing, they seemed designed to make anyone feel small, especially someone who didn't belong. Elena moved slowly, every step careful, her ears tuned for the faintest sound, voices, footsteps, any sign of life. There was none. Only silence. Then she saw him. Standing near the tall window at the end of the hall, his back to her, Cassian Hale was still as a painting. The outside light traced the lines of his silhouette, casting a pale glow along the edge of his tailored coat. He didn't turn when she entered. "You're awake," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, measured, distant. Elena's hands curled into fists. "What do you want from me?" For the first time he looked at her. His gaze held no warmth, but also no cruelty. Just nothing, as if she were neither burden nor treasure, not even a person. That emptiness sent a chill down her spine. He had spent a fortune on her. People didn't spend that kind of money on nothing. Before she could speak again, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the quiet folds of his home without another word. Elena stood frozen for a moment, then spun around and moved quickly, heart pounding, past the silent portraits, past the closed doors, toward the nearest exit. She pushed the door open and ran. She made it only a few steps before a familiar figure emerged in her path. Cassian. His expression was unreadable, his tone almost bored. "You don't understand why you're here, do you?" The days that followed blurred into a quiet unraveling. Elena roamed the vast halls of the estate, trying to understand the place and the man who owned it. There were no staff bustling about, no clatter of dishes from the kitchen, no footsteps upstairs, no music, no laughter, just silence. A mansion this size should have been filled with life. Instead, it felt more like a showroom, a place carefully arranged for guests who would never arrive. She wandered past tightly closed doors into rooms that smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil, libraries with unread books, studies with desks too perfect to have ever been used. It was as if the entire house had been built to impress someone, and then forgotten. The few staff she encountered moved with quiet precision, speaking only when spoken to. Their answers were brief, polite, distant. When she gently asked one housekeeper why no one ever spoke freely, the woman's voice had dropped to a whisper. "Mr. Hale does not like disruptions." That phrase echoed in Elena's mind for hours. Was he truly the master here, or just another ghost? She began testing the limits, leaving doors ajar, moving objects slightly out of place. No one corrected her. No one responded, not even him. Cassian remained a shadow in his own home. She saw him only in brief glimpses, passing through a hallway, appearing silently at the top of a staircase, always quiet, always observing. Once, she found him in the library, seated in a leather armchair with a book resting on his knee. But he wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on the fireplace. The flames flickered in his gaze, his hand motionless on the open pages. Elena stood in the doorway, waiting. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. And yet, there was one thing she had come to believe without question. Cassian Hale never left the house. She watched, waited. No cars came for him, no visitors, no signs of departure. He didn't so much as step onto the balcony. For all his wealth and power, his world was confined within these walls. A prison, she thought. Not unlike mine. But why? Why would a man who could have anything choose to live like this? Like a secret locked in a gilded cage. If she was going to escape this place, she needed to understand the one who held the key. And to do that, she would have to go deeper, closer, even if it meant unraveling him piece by piece. He stood alone at the end of the hall, a half-empty glass of something amber-hued resting loosely in his hand. Elena had only meant to pass unnoticed, but something in Cassian Hale's stillness caught her mid-step. His posture was rigid, yet oddly depleted, like a statue carved from exhaustion rather than stone. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked on a single door at the far end of the corridor, its frame dark and unmoving. But there was something in his gaze, something hollow and strained, that made her pause. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass. His jaw flexed once, as though steeling himself against an invisible weight. For the first time since she had arrived, he looked human. Elena opened her mouth, uncertain of what she meant to say. But the moment broke. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Silas Mercer. She had seen him before, drifting through the mansion like a shadow, watching, listening, present, but never involved, until now. This time there was sharpness to his presence, a friction. "This isn't wise," Silas said, his voice low, clipped. His gaze swept over her, unreadable but cold. "She's a liability." Cassian didn't move. He turned slowly from the door, his expression sliding back into its usual calm indifference. He took a sip of his drink, unhurried. "She's not your concern." Silas's eyes flicked to Elena then, and in that moment she understood something chilling. He wasn't looking at her like she was a threat. He was looking at her like she was nothing. A misplaced object in the wrong room. "She's a distraction," he muttered. "And distractions have consequences." Cassian placed the glass on a nearby table, with quiet precision. The sound was barely audible, but it echoed with intent. "She is not to be harmed." A muscle in Silas's jaw twitched. "You're not thinking clearly." Cassian's voice lowered, soft, sharp. "Do you really want to test me?" The silence between them thickened, not with noise but with pressure. Eventually, Silas stepped back. His eyes returned to Elena once more, impassive, dispassionate. Then he turned and disappeared down the corridor. But the warning in his silence lingered long after his footsteps faded. The phone rang. Cassian didn't rush to answer it. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as he lifted the receiver to his ear. Then came a voice, smooth, mocking, intimate. "Cassian, my old friend, how's the new edition?" The room shifted. Cassian's body went utterly still. Not the detached stillness she was used to, but something sharper. Alive, coiled, dangerous. And in that moment, Elena saw something terrifying in him. Hate, raw and absolute. Whoever was on the other end of that line, he didn't fear them, but he despised them. The forest was a blur of shadows and wind as Elena ran, her breath cutting through the cold night like glass. The key had been almost too easy to take, left carelessly on the edge of a desk like it was meant to be found. Part of her had wondered, but the rest of her had moved, fast and desperate, past the threshold of hesitation. Now she sprinted through the trees, bare feet pressing into the damp soil, branches slicing the moonlight into fractured beams. She had no map, no direction, only the overwhelming need to not be there, to be anywhere else. Her lungs burned, her heartbeat thundered. But as the woods deepened and time passed without pursuit, she began to feel it, that creeping sense that something was wrong. No shouts behind her, no footfalls, no one coming, only the wind in the trees and the feeling that she wasn't alone. She twisted, trying to veer off course, too late. A hand caught her wrist, not violent, not painful, but absolute. She spun, instinct flaring, until she saw his face. Cassian. He wasn't out of breath. He hadn't chased her. He had been waiting. "You knew," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't speak. He just held her wrist, lightly like a tether. Then he let go. She stumbled back, catching herself, breath ragged. "You left the key out on purpose," she said, eyes narrowing. Cassian's jaw tensed, but he didn't deny it. "You were always going to try," he murmured. Her pulse was still racing, a steady beat against her ribs. She should have been afraid, should have expected consequences, some punishment for daring to run. But Cassian Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand. He only asked softly, "Where would you go?" Elena opened her mouth, ready to answer with sharp defiance. But the words never came, because beneath all the instinct and bravado, the truth pressed against her like a weight. There was nowhere, no home, no one waiting for her. She had spent so long running that she'd forgotten why. Forgotten that beyond escape, there had to be something to run toward. Cassian must have seen it, the flicker of hesitation in her face. His head tilted ever so slightly, as if he had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the mansion, leaving her behind, leaving her with a choice. Elena stood still in the darkness, arms rigid at her sides, cold creeping up her legs from the damp earth. She could stay, lost, alone, pretending freedom was enough. Or she could follow the only person who had ever asked her a question instead of issuing an order. With a low, frustrated breath, she turned and followed him home. Later, she sat curled at the edge of the grand staircase, arms wrapped around her knees. The house felt different tonight, heavier, as though something unspoken had been stirred, and now pressed against the walls, waiting to be acknowledged. She had expected fury when she returned, a reckoning. Instead, Cassian had walked ahead of her in silence, neither dismissing nor welcoming her, just letting her exist behind him, as if her rebellion hadn't disrupted anything at all. Now he stood near the fireplace, back to her, the flames casting warm light across the floor. In one hand he held a glass of amber liquid, but he didn't drink. "You weren't supposed to be here." The words fell from his lips like a confession, quiet and reluctant. Elena lifted her head. "What does that mean?" Cassian exhaled, setting the untouched glass down with deliberate care. "It means I made a mistake." A strange emotion flickered through her. Anger? Confusion? "A mistake?" she repeated. "So what? You brought me here by accident?" He didn't answer, but for the first time since she had met him, something in his perfectly measured expression shifted. A crack in the mask. His gaze flickered, haunted, unreadable, and then closed again. She stared at him, eyes narrowing. He wasn't telling her everything. But this was something. The first glimpse of a truth he hadn't meant for her to see. She opened her mouth to press further, but then a sound broke the stillness. A sudden, startling crack from another room, sharp and unnatural. Cassian reacted instantly. Without hesitation, he moved to her, his hand closing gently but firmly around her wrist. "Come with me." There was no panic in his voice, just calm urgency. They moved quickly through the hall as shadows stirred at the edges of her vision. Figures. Movement. She couldn't make them out clearly, only that they did not belong here. And then, just as quickly as it had come, everything was still again. The air was different. Tense. But the storm, whatever it had been, had passed. Cassian stood near her, his breath steady, his gaze sweeping the space like he was measuring the weight of something unseen. Then he turned to her. His voice was low. "Go to your room, Elena." She nodded, legs moving before her mind caught up. Hours later, the estate was calm again. No sign of what had occurred. No broken glass, no voices raised in alarm. The space had been restored to its pristine perfection. And yet, the stillness now held a different weight. In her room, Elena sat awake, untouched by sleep. The events of the evening played again and again in her mind, not in images, but in feeling. The tension in the air, the way Cassian had stepped between her and something she couldn't name. The quiet urgency in his voice. She didn't understand the full picture. Not yet. But for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger trapped in someone else's world. She felt like a thread in a tapestry she had not yet seen, and she intended to keep pulling until it all unraveled. She kept replaying it. Not what he had done, but how he looked afterward. Cassian Hale had acted without hesitation, calm, clinical, distant. But it wasn't the act itself that lingered in her memory. It was the silence that followed, the stillness, the look on his face. Not rage, not triumph, just exhaustion. Now Elena stood in the doorway of what she assumed was his study. He sat at his desk, wrapping a white bandage around his forearm. A thin, clean cut marked his skin, barely noticeable, but the only evidence left behind. His movements were steady but lacked their usual precision. He wasn't being careful tonight. The fabric slipped slightly, a smear of red blooming at his wrist. Before she could stop herself, Elena stepped forward. "You're doing it wrong," she murmured. Cassian didn't look up. "You should be asleep." She ignored him. She wasn't sure why she cared. Maybe because he hadn't locked her away. Maybe because he had stepped between her and something she didn't yet understand. Or maybe because, for the first time, he didn't seem untouchable. She reached for the bandage, and surprisingly, he let her take it. Without a word, she began wrapping his arm again, her hands moving gently, instinctively. Finally, his eyes met hers. Something flickered there, something unnamed. But he didn't pull away, didn't stop her. They sat in silence, the space between them charged, heavy with all the words neither of them knew how to speak. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, he said, "I didn't bring you here to hurt you." Her hands paused, just for a heartbeat, then finished the knot. It wasn't what he said that shook her, it was the way he said it. Flat, certain, as if it had always been true, even if he'd never said it out loud. She took a breath, steady but uncertain. "Then why?" His jaw tensed. For a moment she thought he might answer, but the moment passed. The distance returned. He stood. "You should rest." She exhaled sharply, watching his back as he turned away. Impossible, man. Yet even as she left the room, she couldn't shake what she had seen. Just for a second, he had let something slip, and it hadn't been indifference. Elena was beginning to understand something about Cassian Hale. He needed control the way most people needed oxygen. Every step, every glance, every quiet word, precise, deliberate. Which meant the only way to get close to him was to disturb that balance, to make him feel. And she was tired of being invisible, so she tested him. At first it was subtle, lingering longer than necessary in the same room, sitting a bit too close in the library, brushing the back of his chair when passing behind him at dinner. He never said a word. But she noticed. A flicker of tension in his jaw, a pause in his movements. Signs so small, most wouldn't have seen them. But she did. And so, she pushed a little more. That night, she found him again. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, gazing into the darkness beyond the glass. The fireplace behind him painted his silhouette in gold and shadow, carving sharp lines into the calm of his face. He didn't acknowledge her presence. She moved closer. Closer than before. Close enough to feel the quiet heat that radiated off his skin. He turned slightly, just enough to let her know he was aware. Her voice was a whisper. "Does anything ever reach you?" He didn't look at her. No. A lie. She tilted her head, letting the silence breathe between them. She wasn't sure why she did it, why she reached out, just enough to let her fingertips graze the inside of his wrist. But she did, and in that sliver of touch, something shifted. He didn't speak, but his breath caught. His fingers moved, just barely, and then as quickly as it came, the moment vanished. But it had been there, real, undeniable, and Elena knew, with the clarity of instinct, she had found the crack in his armor. For a moment, he seemed caught between two instincts, reaching for her or stepping away. Cassian Hale turned fully toward her, and Elena suddenly wasn't sure if she had gained ground or stumbled into something far more dangerous. His expression was unreadable. Not cold, not unfeeling, just unfathomable. And in that uncertainty, a shiver passed through her, not from fear, but from something deeper, something ancient. He studied her closely, his voice low and even. "You don't want to see what's inside me." Her heart beat faster, because for the first time since meeting him, she believed him. And yet, she didn't know whether she wanted to retreat or step closer. Elena knew she was walking a fine line. She always had. Rules were never her strength, especially when they came from someone who refused to give her the truth. Cassian had surrounded himself with walls, impenetrable and silent, but even the strongest fortress develops cracks, and she had found one. His study. He never locked it, never spent much time there. He would enter, stay a few minutes, and leave, as if the room pressed in on him, as if it held too much weight. Whatever he kept inside, it mattered. So Elena waited for her moment. She moved through the house the way she had learned to, quietly, deliberately, invisible. Now alone in the study, she combed through the surface, books, folders, ledgers, until her eyes caught something tucked behind a row of antique novels. A small wooden box. Locked. Her fingers traced its edges, mind calculating. Before doubt could take hold, she reached for a letter opener from the desk. A delicate twist of the wrist, a soft click. The latch gave way. Inside, she found memories. Not jewelry, not wealth, just old, yellowed clippings, folded with too much care to be forgotten. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the first one. A headline stared back at her. "Tragedy strikes prominent Hale family. Fire leaves only one survivor." Her breath caught. She scanned the article, eyes moving too fast, trying to absorb too much. A house, gone. 2 lives lost, and beneath it, a photograph. A boy barely older than a teenager, standing in the ruins. His face blank, but behind that blankness, something darker than grief. Elena's hands tightened around the fragile paper. This was it. The piece of him she hadn't been able to name. The shadow that lived behind his eyes. Then, the air changed. Something behind her. She looked up slowly. Cassian stood in the doorway. But this wasn't the man of silence and restraint. This was someone else. His eyes burned. Not wild, not loud, but furious. For the first time, she saw what danger looked like when it wore a human face. Elena didn't move. Couldn't. The paper still in her hands. Cassian stepped forward, slow, composed, put it back. The words were quiet, but final. She remained still, unsure whether her defiance was bravery or foolishness. His voice dropped further. Now, she had stepped across an invisible boundary. And this time, she wasn't certain there was a way back. The storm had arrived like a sudden breath of winter, lashing rain against the mansion's windows, wind howling through the trees outside, as if the world itself had been caught in Cassian's unrest. Elena sat curled on the floor near the fireplace, knees drawn in, gaze fixed on the flames as they danced in silent ritual. She hadn't meant to stay here. But the warmth was something she hadn't realized she needed, a contrast to the cold that lived in every polished surface of this house. Cassian sat nearby, his usual chair positioned by the fire. He looked different in the flickering glow, less distant, less untouchable. The sharpness of his features softened by the light, his eyes shadowed by thoughts he didn't speak. They didn't talk. But the silence was no longer hostile. It simply was. A space neither of them had to fill. And in that stillness, Elena wondered, not for the first time, what it would mean to stop running. Not just from him, but from the version of herself that had never trusted anyone to stay. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt fragile, like the hush before glass shatters. And it was Elena who broke it. "I read about the fire." She expected distance, deflection, perhaps even anger. But Cassian didn't turn to her with cold eyes or sharp words. He simply exhaled, a long, weary breath that spoke of truths too old to rehearse. They didn't get the story right. His voice was quiet, as if saying it aloud might unravel him. Elena shifted slightly, her gaze steady. Then tell me what really happened. The fire crackled gently between them, the only sound in the heavy stillness. For a long time he said nothing. And then he did something he had never done before. He let her in, just a little. I lost them, he said. And I should have gone with them. The weight of those words settled deep in her chest. This wasn't just grief, it was guilt. Guilt he had never spoken of, never shared. Before she could stop herself, Elena moved. Not dramatically, not intentionally, just a soft, human impulse. She reached out, fingertips brushing the back of his hand. The touch was so light it could have meant nothing. But it meant everything. Cassian went still. His breath caught, and for one suspended heartbeat, he didn't move. He didn't pull away. He simply was, as if the moment had stunned something into stillness inside him. But then, he stood. The warmth of his skin disappeared. His expression shuddered again. His voice, when it came, was cool and distant. This can't happen. Elena blinked, the sting of his retreat sharper than she expected. But before she could respond, he was already walking away, each step placing more space between them. She sat frozen, the ghost of his touch still lingering. And for the first time she realized he wasn't pulling away because he felt nothing. He was pulling away because he felt too much. Elena had always known how to disappear. It was a skill learned in foster homes and shelters, moving quietly, slipping between shadows, surviving by becoming unseen. That instinct guided her now. She hadn't meant to overhear. Restless after Cassian's sudden withdrawal, she had wandered the halls, drifting like a thought unspoken. And that's when she heard them. Voices, low, tense, behind the half-closed door to the study. Silas. She didn't know him well, but his presence always felt like pressure, measured, deliberate, vaguely threatening. Cassian's second in command, though loyalty didn't quite seem like the right word. Elena pressed herself against the cool wall, just out of sight. He doesn't see it, Silas murmured, voice low but edged. But I do. A second voice replied, unfamiliar, cold. Gabriel, you're saying Hale is slipping? Silas didn't hesitate. I'm saying he's not who he used to be. A pause. Then Gabriel again, sharper. Because of the girl? Elena's heart stumbled. Silas let out a breath, short and bitter. He never should have brought her here. He's distracted, vulnerable. And you and I both know. Another pause. Men like that don't last long. A silence followed, slow, deliberate. Then Gabriel laughed, low, cold, calculated. Then maybe it's time we remind him what happens to men who forget their place. The words twisted in her gut. She didn't wait to hear the rest. Every part of her was alert now, breath tight in her chest as she moved quickly but silently through the corridors. One thought pulsed again and again through her mind. Cassian is in danger. But as she neared the grand staircase, another thought crept in. Darker. More complicated. Should she warn him? He had taken her, yes, trapped her in a gilded maze of questions. He had held her at arm's length, refused to explain, and turned away just when she had reached out. This could be her moment, her chance to disappear, to run, to leave this place and him behind. If Silas was right, if Cassian had truly grown vulnerable, she might never get this opportunity again. And yet she stopped at the top of the stairs, her hand on the banister, her body facing freedom, her heart caught somewhere else entirely. If Cassian Hale was losing his grip, this house, his carefully curated world, wouldn't stay quiet for long. Elena paused at his bedroom door, her fingers hovering over the handle. A choice. Warn the man who had held her here without explanation, or walk away, let him face whatever was coming. She could still do it. She could turn back, slip through the shadows, and vanish like she had so many times before. But something twisted in her chest at the thought. Silas was turning on him. Gabriel was coming. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, despite every wound and every unanswered question, she knocked. Her hand hung in the air a second too long, suspended in hesitation. But she didn't run. Not this time. A beat of silence. Then his voice, calm and steady as always, come in. She stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind her. The space was dimly lit, warm from the fireplace. Cassian stood near the mantel, one hand resting on the carved stone, his back to her. He didn't turn. You're awake late, he said. Even now, his tone was collected, composed. He didn't know yet, not what she had heard, not what was coming. Elena took a breath, forcing the words to form. "I overheard something," she said quietly. "Something you need to know." That got his attention. He turned. Those dark, unreadable eyes landed on her. "Go on." She hesitated, only for a moment. Then she said it. "Silas was speaking with someone, a man named Gabriel. They're planning something. They think you've changed, that you're vulnerable." She studied his face carefully, bracing for a reaction. There was none. His gaze didn't waver. His posture didn't shift. "And you're telling me this because—" The question was measured, not accusing, but it landed with weight. Elena stiffened. "Because you deserve to know." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing just slightly. He was reading her. And for a moment, she wasn't sure what he saw. The silence between them stretched until she regretted coming at all. Then, a flicker, not gratitude, not relief, something quieter, almost close. He stepped toward her, careful, controlled, but not cold. "You could have left," he said. Her pulse quickened. "I know." Cassian held her gaze. And then, with the faintest softening of his voice, he said, "You did the right thing." She blinked. Of all the things she'd expected, that wasn't one of them. Before she could find words to respond, he turned, pulling out his phone. "If Silas thinks I'm weak," his voice changed, no longer intimate, now all business. "He's mistaken." The quiet between them settled again, but it felt different. Not hollow, just heavy with things unspoken. Elena moved toward the door. She had done what she came to do. But before her hand touched the handle, he said, "Elena." She turned, a pause. Then softer, almost reluctant, "Get some sleep." She nodded once, then stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. And as she walked back through the house, she realized something unfamiliar was stirring in her chest. Something lighter. Not because she had nowhere to run, but because, maybe for the first time, she didn't want to. She found him in the library the next day. He stood near the bookshelves. Still as ever, the scent of old paper curling in the air around him. The fire cast golden light across the spines of worn novels and the sharp lines of his profile. He didn't move when she entered, but he didn't ask her to leave either. Since the night she'd warned him, something between them had shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but undeniably. She didn't know what made her ask. Maybe it was the way he stood, tense but composed, like a man still carrying something heavy. Maybe it was that she had already come too far not to wonder. Her voice was quiet. "Who was in the fire?" Cassian's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn her away. Didn't lie. Didn't hide. Not this time. Elena stepped closer. "It was your family, wasn't it?" Silence. A long one. Then, finally, he spoke. "Yes." And with that single word, he let her in just a little further. Not through answers, but through truth. She stepped closer, her heartbeat rising in her chest. "You survived." Cassian let out a breath, not quite a laugh, but far from any kind of relief, if you can call it that. Elena watched him carefully. His hand rested on the edge of the bookshelf, fingers curled tight, the strain in his knuckles barely hidden. Controlled. Always controlled. But beneath the surface, pain. She had seen him wear many faces. The composed businessman, the impenetrable observer, the man carved from shadow and silence. But this was something else, something real. "Gabriel," she murmured, piecing together the weight of what she'd overheard. "He wasn't just a rival, was he?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "No," he said softly. "He was my father's closest friend." A pause. Then, quieter still. "And the man who betrayed him." The words settled like stone between them. Elena's breath caught. She had thought she understood Cassian's sharpness, the way he moved through the world like he was holding something back. But this wasn't coldness. It wasn't armor. It was grief. Raw and ancient, the kind that had nowhere to go. And suddenly she saw it all differently. He hadn't been fighting the world. He'd been fighting himself. She took another step forward, her hand lifted before she could think, her fingers barely brushing the inside of his wrist. A feather-light touch. And yet, he didn't pull away, didn't flinch. For a single breathless moment, the storm between them went still. Their eyes met, and her voice, soft as the wind through broken glass, said, "You don't have to do this alone." Cassian's gaze held hers, something unreadable flickering in its depths. Then, he stepped back. Just a few inches, but the space opened like a wall. The moment vanished, but Elena had seen it. She had seen him. and no matter how far he tried to retreat into silence, she knew. She wasn't done reaching for him. The storm outside had thickened, wind clawing at the windows, rattling the old glass in its frame. Elena stood in the center of his study, staring at the fire as it cast golden tremors across the walls. She didn't know why she had come. Maybe it was Gabriel's name still echoing in her chest. Maybe it was the shift between them she couldn't forget. Or maybe it was that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Cassian stood near the shelves, his back to her, one hand resting against the desk. His posture was rigid, held, but frayed at the edges, like someone trying to hold a crumbling wall in place with bare hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. Elena stepped forward. "Why not?" He let out a breath, sharper this time. "Because I can't." He stopped himself, jaw tight. "Because you don't understand what you're doing." She swallowed. "Then explain it to me." Slowly he turned, and when he looked at her, her breath caught, because for once there was no mask, no distance, only fire. "I can't," he whispered, "because if I do, I won't be able to stop." The words sank into her like gravity. Cassian Hale, always in control of himself, of the world, of her. But this wasn't control. This was the edge of something else entirely. And she wasn't sure she wanted him to stop. She took one more step. "Then don't." Something in him snapped. Or maybe finally gave in. Before she could take another breath, he crossed the space between them. His hand tangled gently into her hair, the other at her waist. And when his lips met hers, it wasn't soft. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a rush of everything he had spent too long burying. Fierce, aching, real. A collision of fear and longing and need. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't careful. But it was honest, and that made it more than she had ever expected. It was as if something inside him had broken. A dam long held back finally giving way. There was no stopping it now. Elena gasped softly against Cassian's mouth, her fingers clutching his shirt like a lifeline. Like if she held him close enough, he wouldn't disappear again, wouldn't bury himself beneath the silence he wore so well. Because she knew this wasn't safe, this wasn't simple, and it wouldn't last. Then, suddenly he stilled. His breath, sharp and uneven, brushed her cheek. He pulled back, just slightly, his forehead resting against hers, hands trembling where they touched her, as though some invisible thread inside him had begun to fray. "I can't," he whispered. Her fingers curled tighter into his shirt. "Cassian," but he shook his head once, slow, final. Then stepped back, like he was tearing himself away. "I can't be what you need," he said, voice frayed at the edges, almost broken. And before she could speak, the door burst open. Elena barely had time to turn before pain bloomed across the side of her skull, bright, searing. Then nothing. Only the sound of Cassian shouting her name as the world slipped into black. She surfaced slowly. Pain was the first thing she felt. A deep, rhythmic pounding behind her eyes, like her heartbeat had migrated to her skull. Then, cold. But not the quiet coolness of Cassian's estate. This was harsher. Damp concrete beneath her skin. The air smelled faintly metallic, rust and something sharper beneath it. Not home, not even close. Her stomach turned, but she forced her eyes open. Dim light flickered overhead. A warehouse. Large, industrial, forgotten. The high ceilings were threaded with exposed beams, chains dangling like forgotten memories. She tried to sit, only to feel the familiar resistance of restraints. Her wrists were bound behind her. Plastic ties biting against her skin. Elena's chest tightened, a prisoner again. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the space. She looked up. Gabriel Devereux. He leaned against a steel table in a tailored suit that looked absurd in a place like this. Too clean, too polished, too calculated. Older than Cassian, but with the same stillness. Except his wasn't quiet strength, it was predatory. "Awake at last," he drawled, pushing off the table and strolling toward her with the leisure of a man who had already won. Elena steadied her breath. "Don't show fear." Gabriel crouched beside her, head tilted slightly, studying her. He murmured. "He does have a type." She glared. "Let me go." He chuckled, as if amused by a child making demands. "Now where's the excitement in that?" She clenched her jaw. "Cassian will come for me." That made him smile, though it never touched his eyes. "Oh, I'm counting on it." He stood, adjusting his cuffs with the careful grace of someone who measured power in the quiet details. "You see, the thing about Cassian is, he thinks he's untouchable. Thinks he can live above all this." He gestured to the warehouse like it was some grand stage. But we both know that isn't true, don't we? Elena didn't answer, wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Gabriel's eyes darkened. He let you go once. Let's see if he's willing to fight for you now. A chill traced its way down her spine, but her expression stayed still. She wouldn't let him see the fear coiled tight inside her. Gabriel sighed dramatically, as if bored with the pretense. There was a time when Cassian understood how the world works, before he got soft. Elena scoffed. Soft? Her mind flashed to Cassian, sharp, decisive, always 3 steps ahead. The way he'd shielded her. The way he'd held her like it hurt. You really don't know him at all, do you? Gabriel's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then, suddenly, he reached out. His fingers gripped her chin, firm and cold. Careful, little guest, he murmured, his voice low, almost mocking. You're not in a place where it's wise to test my patience. But Elena didn't flinch. Not this time. Because for all the power in his posture, all the control he pretended to wield, she had seen what real power looked like. And it wasn't Gabriel. It was Cassian Hale. And she had a feeling he was already on his way. Gabriel held her gaze for a second longer, then released her. He stepped back, exhaling like he'd just shaken off the weight of a performance. Then, with a casual elegance that felt somehow more menacing than fury, he turned to the metal table, picked up a sleek black phone, and pressed a button. The moment the call connected, Elena's stomach dropped. Cassian, Gabriel greeted smoothly. There was silence. Then, a voice on the other end, low and sharp enough to cut glass. If you touch her, I'll put a bullet between your eyes. Gabriel's grin widened. Ah, there he is. Elena's chest tightened. Cassian didn't sound angry. He sounded lethal. Gabriel gave her a sideways glance, then turned slightly away, as if the conversation were a mere business arrangement. You have 24 hours, he said. Come alone, or she dies. A long pause. Tense, unyielding. Then Cassian's voice returned, quiet and devastating. I'll see you soon. The call ended. Gabriel hummed with approval, tossing the phone aside like it was just another piece in the game. He looked at her and smiled. Well, he mused, that was easier than I expected. Elena swallowed hard. The dread rising inside her wasn't for herself. It was for him. For Cassian. Because for the first time since she had met him, he wasn't in control, not of himself, not of the outcome. And that made him dangerous. Cassian Hale had never acted without calculation. Every step, every word, every silence. Measured, intentional. But not now. Now, the moment Gabriel's voice had vanished from the call, Cassian moved. Fast, unyielding, focused. She was in danger, and Cassian would tear down the sky to bring her back. His footsteps echoed through the halls of his estate like thunder, each one charged with purpose. Staff stepped aside instinctively, the air around him magnetic, pulling all eyes and all fear toward his path. Silas stood at the entrance, waiting, hesitant. Cassian didn't slow. Gather the team. His voice was steel. Silas hesitated, just a breath. Cassian's eyes cut toward him. No second request, just pressure. Enough to make Silas nod quickly and disappear down the hall. Cassian barely noticed. He was already calculating. Where would Gabriel take her? How long before he moved again? How far was he willing to go? His hands curled into fists. Gabriel thought this was a game, that Cassian would follow rules. But Cassian wasn't playing. Minutes later, the assembled men stood in the great hall. Some looked uncertain, nervous. They knew what this meant. They'd seen him furious before. But this was different. This was final. Cassian stood before them, his face unreadable, his jaw tight. Listen carefully, he said, his voice low, lethal. We are not negotiating. A pause. We are not waiting. The air shifted. We are ending this. No one spoke. No one dared. His next words came quieter, but sharper. I don't care what it takes. Bring her back. Silas stepped forward. You're outnumbered. Cassian's gaze met his, unmoving, unblinking. I don't care. And Silas didn't argue, because they all knew the truth. If Gabriel had intended to let her go, he never would have taken her at all. There was only one way this ended. Cassian turned toward the door, his coat slicing through the air as he moved. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air thick with damp silence, the sky low and heavy. His men followed, ghosts in black slipping into silent vehicles, a shadow rising to strike. Cassian slid into the driver's seat, fingers tightening on the wheel. His breath was calm, but beneath it, a single thought burned like fire. Gabriel had taken something from him, and now Cassian was going to take everything back. The air inside the warehouse was thick with dread, the kind that settles before the first strike is thrown. Elena felt it, the silence before the storm, the ache of inevitability pressing in from all sides. She had lived in the shadow of fear long enough to sense when it was about to break loose. But tonight, she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was done being powerless. Outside, the high screech of tires tore through the stillness. Voices snapped into motion, shouts, footsteps, panic. But Elena heard only one thing. Cassian was here, and everything unraveled. Chaos erupted. The first crack of confrontation shattered the quiet like lightning splitting a tree. Cassian moved through the mayhem like a blade through silk, silent, sharp, merciless. There was no hesitation in him now. No mask, no rules, no restraint. He wasn't fighting for control, he was fighting for her. Elena could barely see through the whirlwind of motion and sound, metal striking stone, bodies hitting the ground. But she didn't wait. Her wrists were raw from the bindings she had torn against. She moved. When a man lunged for her, she ducked low, years of instinct rising to the surface. Her elbow drove into his ribs with a satisfying crack. He stumbled. She didn't hesitate. Her hands found the weapon at his side, not a tool of power, but a choice, not a victim. She turned, heart hammering in her chest, just in time to see another figure raising his arm toward Cassian's back. Cassian! He turned. Two bursts echoed in unison, hers and his. The man fell. Their eyes met across the fractured space, breathless and disbelieving. A flicker passed between them, something unspoken. And then, Gabriel. He stepped into view like a specter from a nightmare. His voice slick and sour. You should have stayed in your cage, Hale. Cassian didn't answer. He moved. They collided in a storm of limbs and fury, the gun knocked aside as fists and fury took over. Gabriel was older, heavier, but Cassian fought like a man with fire in his blood. Even wounded, even bleeding, he was stronger, sharper. Unforgiving. Gabriel landed a hit. Cassian faltered. But he didn't fall. He twisted, redirected the force, drove Gabriel backward with ruthless intent. In one seamless movement, Cassian seized the blade from Gabriel's belt, not with hesitation, but with purpose. One strike, precise, final. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widened, disbelief and rage tangled in silence, but no words came. Cassian twisted the knife and let him fall. The room stilled, only the distant sound of shouts and retreat remained. Elena exhaled, the gun shaking in her hand. Her knees nearly gave out, but then she saw him. Cassian, swaying on his feet, blood soaking through his shirt. The moment snapped. She was at his side before she realized she'd moved. Her arms caught him as his weight folded into her. Cassian, she whispered, bracing him, her voice thick. It's over. His breath stuttered. Not yet, he murmured, barely there. Not until you're safe. Elena pressed her hand to his wound, panic clawing through her as warmth seeped between her fingers. Stay with me, she choked. Please stay. His head tilted toward her. His gaze, heavy-lidded, dazed, found hers. And for a moment, something vulnerable flickered through the man she had once thought unbreakable. Elena, he breathed, her name more fragile than she had ever heard it. Don't talk, she said fiercely, pushing harder against the wound. Just hold on. A faint, crooked smile ghosted across his lips. You're getting good at giving orders. Her throat tightened. Tears burned but didn't fall. Then listen to this one. She leaned in, forehead against his. Don't die. Cassian's eyelids fluttered, his body growing heavier against her, and Elena could feel the weight of him slipping. No. Her voice cracked. She hadn't come this far, fought this hard, just to lose him now. Cassian? His fingers brushed her wrist, barely there, like the last flicker of flame before darkness. And then, his voice, steady, worn thin but true. I thought I was saving you. The words hit her harder than any bullet. She froze. He swallowed, breath shallow, and yet, he held on. But, you saved me. Elena's heart fractured. This man, cold, impossible, unreachable, had let her in, little by little, even when he tried not to, and she wasn't going to lose him now. Then let me save you again, she whispered. His lips parted as if he had more to say, but his body tensed, pain shuddering through him. Elena tightened her grip, holding him to her. Stay with me, please. Footsteps echoed. Voices shouted, distant, cutting through the haze. Silas's voice, sharp and urgent. We have to move now. Hands reached for Cassian, pulling him from her arms. Everything swayed, her vision spinning, sound warping. But she didn't resist. Couldn't. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was his hand, reaching for hers. Fingers stretched toward her, and then nothing. The mansion felt different now. Lighter, emptier. Elena stood in the grand foyer, her bag slung over her shoulders, staring at the massive front doors. Once, they had seemed like walls. Now, they were open, and Cassian was the one who had opened them. He stood a few feet away, his expression carefully blank, his hands curled at his sides like he was holding back a war. "You're free to go," he said. His voice was even. Too even. Elena's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. This was what she had wanted. Freedom. A life beyond this place, beyond the shadows and secrets. So why did her chest feel heavy instead of light? She looked at him, searching for something. A sign, a reason to stay. But he wore the mask again, sealed tight, unwritable. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Cassian's jaw clenched. "Yes, I do." Her voice was barely a breath. "Why?" A pause. He looked down, just for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw. "Because keeping you here would be selfish." Her breath hitched. "You were never meant to stay," he murmured. "You deserve more than this, more than me." The ache in her chest twisted. He really believed that. "Cassian, go," he said, rougher now, strained. "Before I change my mind." Her pulse thundered in her ears. This was her chance, to leave, to begin again. She took a slow step forward, stopping just inches from him. "If I walk away," she whispered, "I'm not coming back." His eyes flickered, just once. Pain, regret, but still he nodded. "I know." Her throat burned. She turned. One step, two. The door opened, cold air struck her skin. And behind her, Cassian Hale, the man who had taken her, protected her, and ruined her for anything else, let her go. Without a word. The city should have felt like freedom. The rush of people, the noise, the pulse of life. She had dreamed of this moment, of what it would be like to be on her own again. But she'd been wrong. The noise felt hollow. The days passed in a blur. She found a small apartment, blank walls, furniture with no meaning. A job at a cafe, early mornings, long shifts. It kept the silence at bay. But not the emptiness. Because she wasn't missing the mansion. She was missing him. This was what she had wanted. Freedom. Distance. A life that belonged to her again. But at night, when the world stilled, when silence pressed into every corner, Elena thought of him. Of the way Cassian had looked at her that last day. Of how he had let her go, not because he didn't care, but because he believed she needed him to. He hadn't fought. And maybe that was what hurt the most. She had expected anger. Maybe even relief. But all she found was a hollow space where something used to be. One night, she found herself reaching for her phone. Her fingers hovered over his name, the one she hadn't deleted. The ache in her chest tightened. He wasn't coming for her, and she had no reason to go back. So why did it feel like she'd left something behind, a piece of herself, that still lived in that mansion? With a soft, steadying breath, Elena set the phone down and curled deeper into her sheets, eyes tracing the shadows on the ceiling. Outside, the city carried on. But inside, she had never felt more lost. The cafe was loud. Clinks of glass, the steady hiss of the espresso machine, voices overlapping. Elena sat at the counter, eyes on the newspaper in front of her, but the words blurred. She hadn't meant to care, hadn't meant to look. But the moment she saw his name, her stomach twisted. Cassian Hale. Callaway Holdings faces collapse. Her fingers tightened around the paper. It wasn't just business. The article hinted at something deeper. Power shifting hands. A man once untouchable, now vanishing. He wasn't fighting anymore, and she knew why. She had told herself he would be fine, that he had let her go for a reason, that walking away had been the right thing. So why did it feel like she'd left something undone? Why did it feel like he had stopped breathing the moment she stepped out that door? The coffee in front of her had gone cold. Elena stood, and for the first time in months, she stopped lying to herself. She had to go back. Not as a prisoner, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who had already made her choice. The drive to Vermont felt longer than she remembered. The mountains loomed ahead, shrouded in rain. The air smelled of pine and memory. The last time she had left this place, she thought she was free. Now she just felt late. The mansion greeted her in silence. Lights dimmed, doors unlocked, as if the man who once watched everything had stopped caring who walked through. Elena stepped inside, her pulse steady. No hesitation this time. She found him exactly where she knew he'd be. The study. Cassian sat slouched in a leather chair, a half-finished glass of whiskey in hand. His once sharp suit hung loose around him. He didn't look powerful. He looked tired, like a man waiting for the last part of himself to disappear. Her chest ached. This wasn't the man who had torn through a warehouse to save her. This was a man who had stopped saving himself. He looked up when she stepped into the room, and for a second, just a breath, something flared in his eyes. Shock. Then it was gone. Elena. His voice was rough. Quiet. She crossed her arms. You look like hell. A slow exhale. Why are you here? She didn't answer right away. How could she explain that every day since leaving, she had felt like she was still running toward him? She took a step forward. Because I was wrong, she said. And so were you. Cassian's fingers tightened around the glass. I let you go. You shouldn't have. Something broke in his expression, just for a moment. Soft. Raw. I know. The space between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything they hadn't said, everything they still could. The mansion had always felt like a fortress, silent, cold, untouched by warmth, a place built from shadows and silence. But tonight, as Elena stood in the center of the study, firelight casting a golden glow over the floor, it felt different. It felt like a choice. She had spent months convincing herself that walking away had been right, that Cassian had been right to let her go, that freedom meant distance. But now, standing here again, with the echo of his absence still clinging to the walls, she finally understood. Freedom had meant nothing without him. Cassian sat in his usual chair, a glass of untouched whiskey by his side. He hadn't changed in any obvious way, but Elena saw it immediately. He looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying the weight of a life that had stopped feeling like one. He didn't look at her at first, didn't move. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, controlled. You should get some rest. But beneath the stillness, something frayed. She exhaled a quiet breath of disbelief. That's all you have to say? He didn't answer right away. Just one soft tap of his fingers on the desk, then stillness again. Finally his eyes met hers. You came back, he murmured. I don't know why. Her heart pounded, steady and sure. Because you let me go. She stepped closer, and I realized that wasn't what I wanted. The silence between them stretched, dense with everything they'd never had the courage to say. When he finally spoke again, it was a question that stripped her bare. What do you want, Elena? And this time, she knew the answer. Not because it was simple, but because it was honest. I want to stay. The words left her lips like a breath she'd been holding for months. Cassian's jaw tightened, his breath caught. But he said nothing. His voice, when it returned, was more armor than man. I won't stop you this time. I know. His fingers curled, as if resisting the urge to reach for her. I can't promise. I'm not asking for promises, she said gently. I'm not asking you to change. Her voice faltered, then steadied. I just don't want to run anymore. She had spent her whole life running, from pain, from belonging, from love. But she wasn't running now. He looked at her like he didn't know what to do with her honesty. Like he didn't know how to hold something that wasn't trying to escape. You're free, Elena. His voice was barely above a whisper. You don't have to stay. She stepped into the final sliver of space between them. Her voice was quiet, but it carried everything. I'm staying because I choose to. Something shifted, a tremor beneath the surface. Cassian's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His eyes stormed with fear, with longing, with a desperate kind of hope. He looked like a man on the edge, and for once not of violence, but of belief. She reached for his hands, unfolding the fists he'd made of them. He let her. Her fingers laced through his, grounding him, staying with him, and something inside him broke. Finally, not in destruction, but in release. You were never my captor, she whispered. His grip tightened around hers, and then so quietly it almost hurt. And I was never your prisoner. The breath he let go of felt like the first one he'd taken in months. And then, at last, he reached for her. Not with possession, not with power, not with guilt, but with choice. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of what they had been and the quiet promise of what they could become, they both understood something true. That love, real love, isn't about saving or owning or fixing. It's about staying when you don't have to. And this time, they both stayed. To everyone who has walked every step of this journey with us, thank you. for holding your breath in the quiet moments, for feeling the ache between the silences, for believing in two broken souls trying to find their way back to each other. This story was never just about darkness and pain. It was about survival, about choice, about the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to love, when it would be easier to walk away. If even one part of Elena and Cassian's story found a home in your heart, then every word was worth it. From the shadows of the past to the light of something new, thank you for staying. We hope their story reminds you, you are never too far gone, and it's never too late to choose love.